to say, if I wanted to move on to an even more, I think, central but interesting point, which is why have life at all? And you said agency, but what agent decided that agency was good? How did evolution think that it needed agency? How did any kind of evolutionary process evolve to be the one that says we need agency? Agency is interesting, but I've come to believe that the big divide, obviously it is a huge divide between the inanimate world and the animate world, but it's not as hard and fast a thing as it would seem to be, in the sense that all the things that life is capable of, inanimate life can more or less do, just very, very slowly and cumbersomely, and not with, as you say, without any agency. So it gets its form changed by forces it interacts with. And it gives rise later to some formation which could have been predicted, etc. And in essence, it can even, perhaps it's stretching the idea, but inanimate substances can produce more of an inanimate substance, so perhaps they even self-propagate. I don't know. But all I'm really saying is that the things that seem so startling about living creatures is, yes, their agency entirely, which suggests agency towards some sort of end, because agency that's entirely random and chaotic wouldn't have any point. So agency must be used in pursuance of something. And the other thing is values. And this came to me rather late, that values are incredibly important, and I think you definitely recognize that in what you wrote. You don't major on it, but I think you do talk about values, and that living things have values. And I don't just mean survival. That's why I say, why have life? Because O.N. Whitehead, who you probably know is one of my favorite philosophers, second only to Heraclitus, said, what is the point of life? If life is about being able to persist, then the secret is never to have been alive. Rocks last for billions of times longer than human beings. And it's also true that evolution has taken us away from length of survival. Actinobacteria at the base of the ocean, some examples of which are 500,000 years old, do very much better even than trees, never mind people. So there's something that attracts something in this process, because I believe there is a kind of a beautiful complexification of whatever it is unfolding. I don't claim to understand it, but that seems to me what I'm witnessing when I know more about the cosmos in which I live. And part of what life does is to respond to value. It responds, in my view, but I don't expect you to go there with me, to things like beauty and to goodness and even to truth. Difficult to interpret in terms of microorganisms, but there are tendencies, and the thing about the human being is that the human being, far more than any other organism, seems to be able to do this kind of responding. And I understand why people, it's fashionable now to sort of demonize really humankind for having been enormously destructive, and I wholly agree with that verdict. But the other side of it is that we were only able to do that because we're also very creative. And human beings, it would not be a good thing if human beings died out in this world, I believe, although it may be necessary for something to recover in the natural order. I don't know. But all I'm really saying is there's something rather special about increasing complexity in evolution that seems to drive a machine against entropy. It's very fragile. It's very costly in terms of energy consumption, and it presents many more problems than having a totally inanimate world.
Well, I'm quite happy to be materialist about this, Ian. I mean, I had a very interesting conversation recently with David Bentley Hart, who has the entirely opposite point of view. You probably understand that, that he believes that actually mind in the beginning of everything is mind, and
So do I. So you've got another one here.
And I love the conversation. I love David's book, and I love your book because it pushes me to really to see to what extent I can defend a purely materialistic approach to this. But at this stage, I'm very happy to have that conservative point of view. That, to my mind, and I think I say in the book, the idea of what is the point of life. It feels to me as though actually, and I say in the book that life itself is what creates a point. Life itself is what creates a meaning. What is extraordinary to me is that as far as we can tell, I'm happy to believe that the laws of physics, nothing more than that, the laws that govern the way matter behaves, make life possible. That's utterly extraordinary. There is no way we would have predicted that from the laws of physics. It's much, much more extraordinary than that there are black holes and all these extraordinary astrophysical phenomena. That's completely understandable as far as I can see. But life, it's amazing that physics itself, as far as we can see, you don't need to add anything to it to get life. The question then, it becomes: is it an inevitability? Is the appearance of life in the universe something that inevitably would happen in a universe like ours? I don't know the answer to that, but I do feel that when that happens, that is when meaning and value become enter into the universe. That actually life itself is what creates that, and I think we can have that. I mean, it sounds. I think to a lot of people it sounds like, okay, you're now deep into metaphysics or something else, or aesthetics, or something that you've left science way behind. But actually taking an evolutionary perspective on all of these questions, just as one can on agency, just as one can on free will and on brains, which I want to come to, that you can do this with meaning and value. That for the simplest organisms we know of, like bacteria, that their task, if you like, if they're going to persist as entities, then they have to, in a sense, perform value judgments on their environment. They're going to have to attend to some stimuli and not to others. They're going to have to notice if there is a depletion of moisture, if things are getting too hot, where the nutrient is, and not attend to other things that are of no value and no threat to them. So that is if you like, I would say that is the evolutionary beginnings of value judgments. That is something that the living system is doing. And we are an extreme elaboration of that. And I take the view that our brains are a way of, having a brain is not something that is essential to be a cognitive system. You said that we have to think of the bacteria as intelligent and in some sense as cognitive. I think that's absolutely right. And in fact, that's a much better. It's probably more than a metaphor, but even if it's just a metaphor, it's a much better metaphor for thinking about life, the cognitive metaphor rather than the computational or the machine. But it seems to me that the brain is, as far as we know on Earth, is this sort of ultimate expression of giving that entity agency. That it is a way of devolving the decision making from some automated, from some genetically programmed system of doing things, which cannot hope to anticipate everything that a complex organism like us will encounter. We encounter things daily that we have never encountered before. We need some better way than just an automated, genetically programmed way of responding to our environment. That is what, if you like, a brain is for. That is what enables a brain that is what enables an organism like us to persist. Whether evolution itself has some directionality towards that degree of complexity, I think is an open question. And in fact, the case has been made, for example, by the evolutionary biologist Mike Lynch, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, that I think it's quite conceivable that you could get to complex organisms like us, if you like, by accident, by neutral evolution that gives rise to increasing complexification in organisms. It doesn't have to be adaptive. It's not obvious to me that something with the complexity that we have is somehow any more finely adapted. I mean, we're certainly no better at surviving than bacteria are, than fungi are. So it's not clear that there's an adaptive benefit. It could just be neutral drift that gives rise to greater complexity. And if that greater complexity is going to persist, then we need all these mechanisms that we talked about earlier, these sort of fuzzy operational principles, these, ability of cells to communicate in ways that don't depend on their fine details. That is going to be necessary for the organisms to persist and be able to adapt and innovate because of the greater complexity of their surroundings. But there may be no directionality in that. But it does end up ultimately with organisms like us that have these brains that are, as far as we know on Earth, the ultimate expression of agency, that they allow us to do things that are non-adaptive. Clearly we're doing things all the time that are non-adaptive. They're able to do things that are creative, that are spontaneously creative for their own sake. We have purposes and goals that no longer have any obvious relevance to survival or to reproduction. There's something else, and that too, if that's the right way of seeing it, that too seems to me to be such an extraordinary thing. That again, the laws of physics ultimately end up, it seems, with these beings that are aware of their existence, that are able to think about that existence, that are able to develop their own strategies, their own programs, their own goals, that seem to have transcended what evolution seems to dictate. Not to have escaped it completely, but not to be totally dependent on that. So that brings us to brains.
Yes, well, maybe, but I think there's more to say before we get to brains. Because you've just said a lot of things. So, I suppose the first thing I would say is, when you say a materialist explanation, does that entail matter has nothing to do with consciousness? It's just, it doesn't have consciousness involved in the idea of matter. Matter is just lumpen matter. Just stuff without any direction, any value, any awareness. Is that right? I mean, that's usually what people mean.
I'm content to start with that as the null hypothesis. I don't think anyone knows how to get from that to consciousness, because of course we have no theory. So yeah, I'm content to stay there until for the time being.
Well, if I may, I'm just going to unfold what I was saying, but I think it's slightly like your entirely accurate remark that Dawkins' problem with the so-called paradox of the organism depends on how you set the situation up. If you set up that the organism can't be like an organism is as we know it, then of course you've got a problem. And I always say the hard problem, the so-called hard problem, it's wonderful that somebody has become famous for simply saying this is difficult. But anyway, there we are. Chalmers' hard problem is as hard as you set it up to be. If you try to get consciousness out of matter that has no element of consciousness, then you really have a hard problem. I don't think that can be right. It doesn't sound logical, and nobody's got near explaining how this trick could happen. But I believe it's due to, as you yourself said, when you get this kind of paradox, it's worthwhile going back to your assumptions and thinking, well, maybe there was something wrong with them. And it seems a much more economic idea that there is consciousness. I mean, we have no experience of anything except through consciousness, and we don't know that there's anything that has consciousness. We only know there are things we recognize in our consciousness that we describe as non-conscious, and maybe it's possible. But consciousness itself must exist. We don't necessarily need a brain to have consciousness, but we certainly need consciousness to know we've got a brain. And it may be that we do need a brain. I really it's a fascinating topic and one that I don't have a perfect answer to, but would it be worth discussing. But just to go back to lumpen matter, does it not trouble you that after years of evolution, lumpen matter can give rise to something like a crucifixion by Cimabue, or the St. Matthew Passion of Bach, or Chartres Cathedral, or whatever, Mozart quintets? This is pretty extraordinary stuff, this matter, if that's what it can do. So, if you like, you're not let off the hook of it being a miracle, if you like. It depends where you put the miracle. I prefer to say nothing comes of nothing. And if these things actually emerge from somewhere, it's because they have complexified or varied or been more creative with something that already has this in it. And what we're seeing is the unfolding, like the unfolding of a bud into a flower, which is the fulfillment, not the negation of the flower. I believe that's the nature of the cosmos that we know. It is creative. And if it is creative, and you agree that it is, of course, you can't really deny it, then where does this creativity come from? What is the urge for creativity? Why not stasis? Why is the universe not actually Newtonian? Why is it not dead until given a push? Why is it constantly on the change, constantly creative, constantly complexifying? And the other thing is about use. So when you talk about value, as you did just now, I'm sure you would agree there are other values, certainly for human beings, than use, but you were really dealing only with what is useful to the organism, what is utilitarian. And you said, we have interests in many things that don't have a point for use. I love that, and I agree with that. And I think that's because we are able to respond to other values than those of mere use. And there is a problem with making use your only or main value, which was pointed out by Lessing in the 18th century, which is that the utilitarian has to answer the question, useful for what? And if the answer is just for more use, then that really doesn't get us anywhere, and you haven't explained anything. If you say useful because it can create something beautiful or good or true, then that's certainly a purpose. And Darwin himself said about beauty, animals can respond to beauty up to a point, but he said they definitely respond to beauty, but where does the beauty come from? He says it twice in different places, which I quote in the book. You've probably read that, but it is a question. Sometimes when one comes up with a systematic, mechanistic answer to a problem, what one has done is, as it were, gloss over the problem of how something so extraordinary emerged at all, given the pessimistic grounds of just more or less dead, nothing, suddenly generating something very, very special.
Yeah, it does trouble me that evolution has come up with the St. Matthew Passion. I think it should trouble me. I think it should trouble everyone. However, I don't know how troubled I should be. I don't know how astonished I should be in comparison with the fact that evolution has come up with, say, the eye. It could sound rather like that discussion of clearly it couldn't have come up with a mechanism so beautifully attuned, so perfectly formed. And there are very good arguments for why it absolutely could, without any kind of design, without anything going on behind the scenes. More in a sense, simple natural selection could do that. The way I think about the extraordinary things that we're able to do that seem to have, I'm sure do have actually, no evolutionary value, that don't have any obvious use, as you say, it's the way I think about that at the moment, as a working hypothesis, is that for organisms like us to cope with the extraordinarily complex, particularly now that we have these extraordinarily complex cultures, to be able to cope with an environment like that, with the cognitive demands that requires, it's no more feasible to think, well, that then, what is needed is a brain that is able to do this and that and that, any more than to think that one could build a laptop that only runs Adobe and Word, and that's all it can do. But of course, computers, by their nature, if they can do that much, they can do all this other stuff as well that actually I never use, probably you never use, but we know it's there. We know that it has that possibility. And I think for me, this is the wonderful thing about brains, certainly about our brains. It's almost as though, evolution. I sort of talk about it as thinking of the genes as the parents and the brain as the child, and the gene says, look, I'm going to give you all of this potential. You can do all of this stuff, but never forget that you've got to be fixated on surviving and reproducing. And then, the genes the parents come back, thousands of years later, and they find the child working out the theory of general relativity, and they say, well, what use is that to what I told you to do? But the point is that if the child has been given that freedom, that ability to innovate, it's going to end up doing those kinds of things. It's going to transcend the uses, if you like, to which it was supposed to be attending. And I think of brains like that, and I think actually of living organisms like that, it's inevitable if they're going to fulfill the strictly evolutionary uses that we can think of them as having evolved for. It's inevitable that they're going to be able to do all this other stuff as well. That's the only way you can make an entity like that. So that may not be sufficient to get around the mystery of the St. Matthew Passion, but I think there are ways to refine that idea in the sense of we can find those capabilities, those potentialities for music, for language, for complex social behavior. We can find them in other organisms. They're not, elaborate to the degree that we're there.
Oh, I completely accept that, and I don't think there's a sudden disjunct when humanity arrives. I mean, there are things that make it a very big step, I know, and one of them is language, but music, which probably predated language, is a way in which birds and animals can communicate, and indeed some tribes, as you know, can also to this day do so. But I don't think that the purpose of everything can simply be utility, because you've then got to explain why there should be this expensive effort in achieving just more utility. Why did the universe not rest? Why is it creative? And why in particular does it move in directions towards things, specific ends, like on the whole, the efforts that you described the child doing later, once it's fulfilled its basic needs of survival, are constructive and creative. I mean, they can be used for destructive purposes, I don't deny, and indeed we're in a world now where I believe that is exactly what's happening, because as you know, I think, and maybe we can talk a bit about brains at this point, that particularly in the human case, two aspects of existence have been sequestered from one another so that they can function best without interfering with one another. It's very hard to explain why the brain should be bipartite at all, but they are. All the brains we know are. They're also asymmetrical, which is interesting, because if you just want more room, why do it asymmetrically? It suggests there's some important difference. And then, of course, the mystery of the corpus callosum, which only arises in mammals. Until then, we did without it altogether. But since we've got it, it's not keeping up in terms of size as the brain expands, and it's getting smaller. And now, a lot of its action, not all of its action, of course, but a lot of its action is inhibitory. So these are the things that set one thinking about this. And if you like, the left hemisphere is the best way of tackling that need for survival, to be able to be that good survivor, which we've always been told was to do largely with competition, and competition is a very valuable thing. But again, I'm sure you would agree with me that the organisms that have survived have tended to be collaborators. And collaboration requires the bringing together of a degree of competition, which is healthy, with a degree of cooperation, which is very healthy. And so the story of the evolution of life is not just read in tooth and claw, but is about the evolution of something that seems to be getting more sophisticated in its way of relating to the world, for no obvious reason of a utilitarian kind. It's certainly not leading to longer lives, and it's expending a lot of energy. So I suspect there are other, I don't think we can get away from, and you don't have to accompany me here, but I must put my cards on the table. I don't think that it's feasible to say that, well, evolution would just do this. Because then you've got to say, well, evolution's a pretty remarkable thing. We just go, evolution will answer all our problems. But actually, where does evolution come from? In that it's not just about hitting one another over the head with clubs until there's a massacre, but actually about finding ways to go through something to produce something bigger and more sophisticated. So evolution does a lot of work in the kind of story which I'm familiar with that you told, but like my question about what is actually matter if it can do this, what is evolution if it can do this, and what are its I want to say goals, but I know you won't like that. But in other words, it's attractive forces. What are the things that lures it onwards? Because something it's moving. I mean, the cosmos is on the move. Everything is moving in a certain direction. I don't just mean physically, but you know what I'm talking about. And I think it's towards greater complexity, and it's towards appreciation that the ability, it seems to me, to reflect values. And I don't believe that values are inventions of human beings that they paint on the walls of their windowless cell in order to cheer themselves up. I believe that they're more basic than that. And you can say, well, I mean, and I'm not saying this is I mean, dogs and apes and things can do very selfless things which will harm them in order to not inflict pain on another creature and so forth. So it's not just us, but of course that only takes you a few steps. But I think that the point here is that there is continuity with animals, and what they are beginning to do is respond to beauty, to be able to cooperate better, and to feel things that are not just feelings that I need to eat or I need to fight or I need to copulate, the 3 Fs, but are to do with higher values, and that they are what actually fulfill us. That somehow there's too much evidence from people who followed paths other than the very reductive and basic one of just what's useful for me, to show that there's enormous value for human beings in sacrifice, in helping others, in producing beautiful things, in bringing up children. This is one that a selfish society is no longer wishing to perpetuate, because of, undoubtedly, as a father of 3 children, I'm not under any illusion that it's all a picnic. But these things are done because they are, to go back to your idea, valuable things in themselves. And so I think there are things that have value in themselves situated in the cosmos that lure us towards them.
If I could jump in and just to say, sure. Since we've now there's this huge theme, which I'm delighted we've gotten here, since now I'm not going to let you get away from the question, Phil, but if you don't mind, Iain and Phil, I'm going to read a part, Phil, of your book that I think is speaking directly to the scientific import of Iain's question, because you say all these processes operate as if in thrall to some overall plan, with us as the goal. Biology looks uncannily teleological. That thought disturbs some biologists to no end. And then you go on to say, that's to say, one of the big challenges for biology is to develop a rational, productive framework for understanding concepts such as agency, information, meaning, and purpose. These are not optional add-ons for the philosophically inclined. And so I wanted to just, of course, I know you wrote that, but I think that's part of what's compelling is I hear a sort of tension, Iain, where you're raising the really great, hard, big question about the necessary implications of what you're doing, Phil. And Phil, I'm curious, besides the direct response to Iain, maybe we could go back to the issue of agency again as a way of focalizing this question, which is, you say in the book this incredible thing, which is that actually biology for 50 years sort of lost the concept of life. And by restoring an argument about what life means, you're enacting a conceptual revolution at the structure of how we think of scientific explanation, which is based on the physical sciences, reductive, and in theory, you can go from simple things all the way up to super complex things, a continuum of explanation. And this is the traditional reductionist program. Maybe we can get everything down to just physics. As you say, of course, whatever the laws of physics are, they can yield life. And I hear, Iain, you're asking, what does that mean about what the background conditions of life are if it's going to produce the St. Matthew's Passion? And so I wonder, Phil, could you talk more about why we have to have this conversation, even at the level of the biology, even if we don't have to deal all of it with culture? But you're arguing we do have to have a conversation about meaning, purpose, and agency as biological and scientific concepts. And so if we have to do that, isn't that really in a way opening up a whole new challenge where the line between philosophy and the natural sciences, Kuhn says when there's a scientific paradigm change, scientists often become very interested in conceptual, narrative, and metaphorical questions. And this is part of why I thought in the book you really are saying, I don't have the new paradigm, but actually we need a new paradigm. So kind of to return just to the question, I think, can you talk about agency, meaning, purpose? Because these sound like minded concepts. So maybe we don't have to explain consciousness to recognize biology itself forces us to talk about intelligence, purpose, goal-directedness. How do we make sense of that as a scientific necessity while also being open to lots of different kinds of answers to Iain's huge questions that we have to ask as, you could say, human beings, but not necessarily natural scientists?
Okay, yes, well, I guess, what I do say in the book is there are ideas about how agency arises and what it is, but I think it's fair to say we don't have a theory, we certainly don't have an accepted consensus theory of what agency is, what elements it requires. I think that it's absolutely something that could be developed. We have the beginnings of that. I think we can identify some aspects of what agents do or what they are. That it is possible to break it down. For example, it seems that to have agency, an entity needs to have some memory. It needs to have some way of representing its environment, such that it can attune itself to that environment and not, perhaps even literally, rather metaphorically, banging its head against the wall, wasting energy. Organisms, if they're going to be if they're going to be evolutionarily viable, they need to be efficient to some degree, and that efficiency comes from having representations of the environment and being predictive of what the environment is going to do, so that it can make a smart choice, if you like, rather than the wrong one. So I think there are ways that we can start thinking about agency. Actually, in quite it may be a mechanistic way. It's certainly in a more reductive way, to understand what the dimensions of it are. Just as I think we need to understand mind and consciousness as something that has many dimensions to it, many elements to it, rather than just being some single magical sort of fluid that something has. So I think that we can begin that discussion, but I think that it's central to the notion of an agent is the notion of goals and purpose. And once we recognise that something has goals, as I said, I think that we can then start to have some sort of, if you like, minimal discussion about value, in the sense that the agent is constantly having to evaluate, does this thing, does this action, does this response, does this other organism help me to reach whatever goal or goals I have? And that's going to be the beginnings of a value judgment. I think maybe the question we've sort of arrived at here is whether that notion of value and meaning is something that can emerge, in a technical sense, from evolution itself, whether evolution, I think I say in the book that evolution seems to me is a goal-generating process, amongst other things. Is that sufficient? Or is Iain right in saying that actually there must be something, there must be some kind of value, some kind of, if you like, meaning system already inherent in the universe to enable that process? And Iain, this is also something you'll know that, David Bentley Hart says that actually that gap seems to be too great a one to be able to bridge through, mechanistic physics-based science. There must be something more to it. I think that seems to be the question that we've arrived at, and for which I have no answer at this point.
Yes, I mean, I think the problem comes from, for me, why bother with life at all, really? I think this is an important question. If there isn't something before life about the constitution of the cosmos that values certain kinds of things over other things. I also just wanted to quote something you say at the outset of your book, Phil, which I think is very correct. The popular view that science is the process of studying what the world is like needs to be given an important qualification. Science tends to this study of what we can study. And that's absolutely true and very important, because there's a lot of things that are very relevant to what life is like for a human being that simply cannot be studied in the lab, if you like. I mean, if science insists that it will deal only with what is measurable and to some extent can be made to be present in the lab and manipulated, and can be measured, then we rule out an enormous amount. And that's not a problem for science. Science starts from very respectable principles that it's going, for the moment, to cut purpose and value out of question because it wants to look at how the system looks if you just ignore those questions for the time being. That's perfectly reasonable. But it's not a logical deduction from having done so to say that there is no purpose and there is no value. But some scientists obviously think that. They think science has proved these things. It didn't prove them, it assumed them at the very start. And so I sometimes say, in words actually borrowed from C.S. Lewis, it's as if a policeman stopped all the traffic in a street and then wrote solemnly in his notebook, "The silence in this street is very suspicious." I think that's a problem. Science is not describing what life is like, as you say. It's describing certain things that it can deal with. And the trouble is they loom very large in discourse as the things that can be relied on. But for me, there are bigger and greater things without which life would mean nothing. And tell me that they're not real. I say experto potest crede. I'm the person who experienced them, and I know that they're real, and I'm not alone. Love. I imagine you've been fortunate to experience love. Is it real? Yes. Can it be measured? No. You can find proxies to measure in the brain, but that's completely another matter. And they wouldn't really help you determining either whether love was present in this brain or what that love was like. So much of what we're dealing with, the most important things, which are the products of all the arts, I think, the products of love, community, fellowship with nature, the experience of things that are beautiful, all of these things are very valuable, and I would add into them the religious sense. I mean, there is no people anywhere on earth until about now over here who thought that there wasn't, and one may, in a Dawkins-like way, well, that's of course because they were very simple people and they didn't know what we know. I think there's more to it than that, and I don't think it can be so easily dismissed. But it's not one of those things, unfortunately, that I can prove to you, because that's its nature, and that's why we're talking about it.
I think scientists are often, I shouldn't generalize too much, but in my experience, many of them are very uncomfortable in sitting in that place of not knowing, which is the place that I feel I want at the moment to be sitting. So, yes. I suspect behind what you said here is the question: if we're going to rule out, if we're going to start without consideration of things like certainly agency, particularly things like love, can we get them back again, in the sense of, if we're going to start from just thinking about genes, can we get the organism back again? Maybe I'm doing the same thing and thinking, well, I'm going to see if we can. I'm going to see if evolution, if materialism can give us back those things. And it may well be, and I absolutely agree, I think it may well be that it cannot, that we can find no coherent narrative that is based in evolutionary biology or psychology or anything else that will give us back those things that matter so much to us. I'm content at the moment to sit in that place of not knowing, but I think it's absolutely that we say that, rather than saying, well, what happens, of course, is people so often say, oh, X is an illusion. It's just Y. It's just the brain. It's just atoms doing things. It's just neurons doing things.
Yeah.
That's
what I call nothing buttery.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, the things that are illusions. Free will is an illusion. Consciousness is an illusion. Love is just an illusion because it's a trick that evolution is playing on you. That's what we need to avoid. That's, it's far better, to me, to sit in that place of not knowing. We know yet, just as we do. Yeah.
You may know that I'm a great fan of unknowing, in fact, and is one of the simple differences between the hemisphere takes is that the left hemisphere needs to resolve something. It needs to have a definite answer too soon. And this can be demonstrated in very practical ways. It's not just a fanciful metaphor. It really does not like the fact that it doesn't know something. Whereas the right hemisphere, seeing much more, knows how little it knows. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. The left hemisphere knows very little, so it thinks it knows the whole story, but it doesn't. It doesn't know what it is it doesn't know. So I'm very much in favor of that, and I would also say that none of the things that I have said are things of which I can be absolutely certain. I wouldn't have wasted all that paper and ink on writing a book which asks the question, what then is true? I'm really just asking, so at this point in life, it's no longer good to say, oh, truth is whatever you think. No. Or that truth is just something that's written in a book, and if you differ from that book, then you're wrong. Or that truth is whatever science tells you about something, and that's the end of the story. None of these is at all satisfactory. So I move into an area which involves necessarily philosophy, humanities, as well as neuroscience, looking at the different ways in which our brain can deal with the uncertainties that are the most important things, I think. And at the end of that, I'm not 100% sure of things, but I have a pretty consistent view that to me makes sense and draws together things from very different parts of life. I mean, I've had this slightly checkered career, drifting around in the humanities and plunging into science and back again and all the rest. And I start from neuroscience, I add in philosophy, and then I look at things like physics and metaphysics. And the interesting thing is that these streams all seem to converge from very different points on this surface of a sphere, if you like, on a core that is pretty similar. And the thing about that similar core that pleases me is it also happens to be the sort of things that have been said by the great wisdom traditions of East and the early West. Before it got corrupted by Platonism and probably by a lot of Christianity. That's not a dismissal of Plato or a dismissal of Christianity, but just that they have had undeniable effects on the way we think. They tend to legalize it and make it rather sort of too formal. But in any case, all I'm really saying is that I agree with you, and long live uncertainty, and let's live there. But that doesn't mean sort of giving up the questions. And it is a great thing, isn't it? Not to feel that because you can't answer a question, you give it up. We keep battering away at these questions, because little by little, more information comes to us. And sometimes they tell us we were moving in the right direction. Sometimes they tell us we were getting it rather wrong, or we need to rejig the paradigm. I believe that's where we're at with biology.
Well, that's exactly what I was thinking, Samuel. Maybe this brings it back to this question of the new biology, that it seems to me that this is the place we are at now, that we could tell. The story of the genetic blueprint was one. provide all the answers we wanted to have. We're now at the stage where I think it's clear that that is no longer adequate. And so we're in this space of not knowing. And, and it often seems in biology, the harder we look, the deeper we look, the less certain it becomes, the more complex it becomes, the more mysterious it becomes. To me, and this is really what I wanted to get across with the book, to me that is such an exciting, how much more exciting is that than the old story of it's all in the genes and taken care of. So it seems that far from being at a point where it's all up in question and how terrible this is, that actually this is a tremendously exciting and tremendously rich time for biology to be in, to have realized that actually we need something more. We need better metaphors, better theories, better experiments, better understanding.
Yeah.
And that's really what I hope the book is about, to say, what a wonderful time biology is in, much more so than 10, 20 years, 20, 30 years ago when we were decoding the genome. It's actually partly thanks to that we are in this position. So let's celebrate that.
I agree wholeheartedly, of course, as you know. Yes, and I like the idea of the image of something that flows rather than a static mechanism, a machine. Nothing in biology is very like a machine. In fact, I sometimes say there's nothing in the universe that's like a machine, except a few million pieces of metal that we created in the last few hundred years. Neither the inanimate nor animate world is like a mechanism. But things do flow, and seeing that they flow and change is what evolution is. And seeing that there is continuity, and seeing that there need not be separations that are hard and fast, but distinctions that are beautiful within an overall seamless whole, is a very good way that we could take forward in science. And I think is happening already in physics, which is always one hell of a lot further down the line than biology. But there we are.
As a physicist, former physicist, I very much like to agree with that, yes.
Very good. There we are.
It's a beautiful image of science, I think, Phil and Ian, to come at the end, sort of to recognize that ignorance isn't a problem in science. Science is this incredibly unique, extraordinary human phenomenon in which ignorance is a kind of great mark of success. It's an achievement of, as you said, Phil, decades of rigorous work in biology. It's not like the genetic revolution was a mistake. It was what led to a far deeper understanding we could have never had without it. And I think the liberating way of understanding that ignorance, when it's scientific and not out of indifference or prejudice, ignorance is a sign of openness to new creativity, new novelty. This to me is part of the meanings of science. I think that's why I think science has an existential import, because ultimately it embodies a way of life in which openness to creativity and openness to ignorance become virtues rather than threats, and disagreement and conversation become beautiful things, beautiful distinctions, like you said, Ian. And so just to conclude this, I wonder if you would both just reflect for a minute or two on a kind of answer. How do you understand the meaning of science to just anyone, whether a scientist or another human being who's not sure? Why should I care about science? I mean, I think anyone listening to this is going to care deeply already, but I think we've said so much already that I think there's an implicit answer you've each given. But the meaning of the cell, the meaning of the organism, why is it so exciting and important for us to care about science? What does science mean to each of you as a kind of concluding thought?
But for me, I think for pretty much every book I've written, actually, and there are quite a few now, there needs to be a point for me in writing those books, whether it's about Chartres Cathedral or quantum mechanics or about life, where I feel re-astonished what I'm writing about. And I need there needs to come a point where my eyes are reopened, where I start to see things that I didn't see before. I found this way back in the book that I wrote at the end of the 1990s on pattern formation in nature. And it was only when I was towards the end of that book, writing that book, and I was standing on a beach in Wales and suddenly realized, I mean, this is what I've been writing about all the time, but it should be obvious to me. But suddenly I thought, all these patterns are around me. The the patterns in the cliffs, they're not random. They look random, but they're not. The patterns in the skies, there are these sand ripples. There are the patterns in the gorse bushes on the cliffs. And it's that re-astonishment that I think is probably the most valuable thing that science can offer, and it's one of the easiest things to lose, and for scientists to lose, because they're having to deal with these, getting their experiments to work day by day, their funding. It's very easy to lose that astonishment. It's also something that was brought home to me in a book. I wrote a book of music, and at one point a music researcher, music psychologist called John Sloboda said to me it seemed to him really important people working on that problem constantly made sure they refreshed their appreciation of music for its own sake, that it wasn't going to dissolve into an appreciation of how we hear this tone as being different from that tone, or this rhythm from that one. That actually you've got to return to music and just be awed by it. So we're back to Bach, as we always should be. And it's that in science. And I think, if scientists can, from time to time, remind themselves of that, of how to be re-astonished by their own work, that would be such a valuable thing to be able to do.
It would indeed, and I so much agree. The difficulty is that wondering at things involves a certain degree of humility and not knowing, which I think is professionally difficult for some scientists. Much easier for physicists, it seems, than biologists. Talking to physicists is a wonderful experience, because they admit that there's very much they don't understand. I think in future biologists will become much nicer as they realize that a lot of their certainties are not as certain as they once thought. But I do think, though, that it's very important. I think that science is terrifically important for both those sort of reasons. And I have a scientific father and two scientific grandfathers, and I was brought up very much on science, and all that was very exciting, and I loved that. But as I started to study it at school, it both became much less interesting, and which doesn't have to be the case, I guess, but when you're inculcating first principles in science, they are mind-bogglingly obvious. It's only much later that you get onto the really interesting stuff. But I think the problem is a divorce from philosophy. I think science on its own is more or less nothing except a heap of data. It's how do you interpret these data, and what sort of a world does that suggest? And I quote both Whitehead and R.C. Collingwood as saying that the divorce between science and metaphysics has been to the credit of neither party, and that they've both suffered from them. In fact, Whitehead says, like every family quarrel, it's been a disaster for both parties. And I think the difficulty is that philosophers think that they're somehow above paying attention to what science reveals, which is a big mistake. But I think scientists in their own way are all sort of snooty about philosophy, that somehow it's a bit of a waste of time. But actually, it's only from bringing these things together again that we can really make leaps forward in our understanding of the world, the meaning of it, not just facts. There's no prize really for the facts. The facts have to be of use in generating an understanding. An understanding is something a human being comes to, bringing many, many aspects of their knowledge, their experience, and so on together. And what really, really worries me at the moment is it was bad enough when we had in the 60s and 70s, when I was studying literature at Oxford, Marxists who just put everything through the mill of Marxism, and if it agreed with what Marx had to say, then it was a good book, and if it didn't, it was a bad book, and there you are. And now that's been followed by, there was deconstructionism, which meant things mean just whatever you want, and the author didn't know what he meant either, and it doesn't matter what the author thought it meant. But we now have every kind of ism, lots of grievance studies and so on, which do just the same to literature, avoid reading it and so on. So that's bad when it comes to the humanities, the misinterpretation of literature and history. But it's worse in science, and there are now movements at your old journal, as you know, to say that if if certain research seems to be correct, but we don't like the answer it gives, we're not going to publish it. Now that, and you may well wish to remain wisely silent, like the monkey that has his hand over his mouth. But I'm just saying for you, and for anyone else who cares about science, once science starts saying we pick and choose our science, depending on whether it fits our current narrative, that is the opposite of science. And once science is discredited, as it will be if that's how it operates, and you can't really rely on something as being a reputable finding in science, we have lost a very, very important lodestone on our journey. What are we going to trust to if we don't have science? That's different from saying that science is everything. As I've said several times today, science is not everything. It's something, though. It's something very important, and we really should protect it. And when scientists themselves attack it, I'm sorry, they've lost my respect completely.
Well, very timely and relevant words. Thank you, Iain and Phil, for giving such clear answers in your own conversation to the productive nature of a conversation between science and philosophy, and a conversation that cares about the distinctions but doesn't think it can really keep them separate. I think it itself has embodied what the Meanings of Science project is about, and I'm so grateful for both of your time, and I hope we can do something like this again in the future. Thank you both.
Oh, thank you so much, Iain. That was delightful to talk to you.
I enjoyed it so much, Phil, and thank you for it.